Chapter 15 of The Web of Indian Life by Sister Nivedita, Margaret E. Noble. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. An Indian Pilgrimage. The old roads of Asia are the footways of the world's ideas. There is a camel track that crosses the desert from Egypt into Syria, broken at the Suez Canal by a ferry. What road in Europe, Roman or barbarian, can compare in charm and pathos with this sandy path? On it we might yet see a woman carrying a child on the back of an ass, and an old man leading them, even as the legends picture the flight of the Holy Family. But it long ago marched the armies of Egypt to meet those of Assyria in destructive conflict on the borders of Israel. By it, Judea sent the streams of her burning thought and fierce ethical emotion into Alexandria, before Christianity was born. Similarly, all over India, away from her ancient high roads, and thrown like a network across her proudest Himalayas, are little thread-like paths like this, ways made indeed by the feet of men, but worn far deeper by the weight of the impelling ideas than by the footprints of the toil-stained crowds. Such roads must once have connected China with Kashmir. Afghanistan, always a province of India, must by just such paths have sent its wandering merchants with nuts and raisins to the south, as long ago as the days of Solomon. Even now it is byways unpaved, deep-trodden, that the long-haired goats scramble down with their loads through the snowy defiles of Bokhara and Tibet, to be sheared in the sunny valley of Jhelum, and furnish wool for its famous shawls. Which comes first, we wonder, commerce or pilgrimage, the trade route or the palmer's path? Would it not appear that the utilities of exchange draw men from their homes to points organically related? And does it not seem reasonable to believe that associations of beauty, arising spontaneously at place after place on the line of march, give birth to the notion of religious privilege and obligation in making a return to particular spots? At any rate, it is certain that behind sanctity of pilgrimage lies admiration of place, of art, even of geographical significance. Benares in the north and Conjeeveram in the south are loved and visited in India for the same reason as Durham or Cologne amongst ourselves. They are cathedral cities, rich in architecture, in treasure, and in association of saints and scholars. Jagannath is placed where it is for sheer beauty of the sea, and perhaps a little also for the old cosmopolitan grandeur of the port through which flowed the eastern trade. Allahabad is sacred because there two mighty rivers join their waters, making her the strategic key to two vast basins, inhabited by different races with diverse traditions, hopes, and folklore. It is the solemn beauty of the Himalayas that makes them the refuge of holy men. The four most meritorious pilgrimages of the Hindus are the four extreme points of India, north, south, east, and west, knowing which the country must be known. The worship of the Ganges, and the reverence that makes a Deccan villager journey as an act of piety to look on the face of one who has seen any of the seven sacred rivers, amongst peoples less poetic, would be simply called the love of place. How large an element of Hinduism is the folklore of the country? To the student who is looking for this, it appears to be past all computing. The Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Puranas are, to a great extent, the outpouring of passionate fancy in local interpretation. In the story of Sati, the perfect wife, who can miss the significance of the 52 places in which fragments of the smitten body fall? And one finger fell in Calcutta, and that is still the Kali Ghat, and the tongue fell at Kangra, Jawalamuktu, in the North Punjab, and appears to this day as licking tongues of fire from underneath the ground, and the left hand fell at Benares, which is forever Annapurna, the giver of bread. No foreigner can understand the crowding of associations into these few sentences. Even the pole star has its Indian myth in the legend of the child Dhruva, whose heart was the steadiest point in all the universe. Nor is the historic element lacking in this unconscious worship of country. Like that of some Indian Bernadette is the story told at a beautiful southern temple of a cowherd who had one cow that gave no milk. He followed her into the jungle and found a natural lingam in the rock, over which she poured her offering freely, of her own devotion. And in proof of the occurrence, Does the temple altar not consist today of that same lingam set in rough living rock? Of such stories the villages are full. Assuredly, a deep and conscious love of place pervades the whole of the Indian scheme. It has never been called patriotism, only because it has never been defined by boundaries of contrast. But the home, the village, the soil, and, in a larger sense, the rivers, the mountains, and the country as a whole, are the objects of an almost passionate adoration, and nowhere are we more impressed by the completeness of Eastern idealism than in this, its relating of itself to nature. Norway, with her broken crags and azure seas and somber pines, her glacier-crowned mountains, and her island-dotted fjords, is surely beautiful. But Norway's memories are always of the heroes, and we miss those voices of the saints that greet us at every turn in every part of India. Brittany, windy and gray, storm-tossed and boulder-strewn, is beautiful. Here, too, the miles are marked with rude calvaires, and the tales of the saints lie like her own moorland mists across the whole Breton land. But this Catholic sainthood never reaches the stern intellectual discipline of Hinduism, and we long in vain for that mingling of mystic passion and philosophic freedom, where holiness merges into scholarship, that at once distinguishes the Orient and weds its race and all their dreams to their soil. It might almost have been St. Francis, but it is actually a Bengali poem of the people that says, quote, "O, Mother Earth, Father Sky, Brother Wind, Friend Light, Sweetheart Water, here take my last salutation with folded hands, for today I am melting away into the Supreme, because my heart became pure, and all delusion vanished, through the power of your good company." End quote. Beauty of place translates itself to the Indian consciousness as God's cry to the soul. Had Niagara been situated on the Ganges, it is odd to think how different would have been its valuation by humanity. Instead of fashionable picnics and railway pleasure trips, the yearly or monthly incursion of worshipping crowds. Instead of hotels, temples. Instead of ostentatious excess, austerity. Instead of the desire to harness its mighty forces to the chariot of human utility, the unrestrainable longing to throw away the body, and realize at once the ecstatic madness of supreme union. Could contrast be greater? It's commonly said that Hindus derive the idea of pilgrimage from the Buddhist worship of relics, but the psychological aspects of the custom make this appear unlikely. Doubtless, the great commercial nexus of the Buddhist period made transport easy, and thus strengthened and stimulated the tendency, just as railways have in modern times opened up the country, and created the possibility of a geographical sense amongst classes who in older days could not have aspired to travel far or often. But in its essence, the institution is so entirely an expression of love for the motherland that it must have been anterior to Buddhism by at least as much as the Aryan occupation of India. If one visits the Canary Caves, hidden amongst the jungles in the north of Bombay, this fact is brought home to one. Here are 108 cells cut out of the solid rock. They are grouped in pairs. Each pair has its own water supply, and wherever the view is finest, wherever a glimpse can be caught of the meeting line of sea and forest, there a staircase and seat will be found specifically carved in the stone for purposes of contemplation. For nature is the eternal fact, and the landscape from this point 1,000 years ago was as beautiful as it is today. Ellora shows at a glance that through century after century it has been a holy place. The Buddhist found it already so, and in due time the Mussulman confirmed the ancient choice, by bringing his illustrious dead to lie in the mighty Feen on its hilltop. But why was it first selected? None who has wakened to the dewy freshness of its morning, none who has glazed thence across the sea-like plain can ask. To all eternity, while the earth remains as she is, Ellora will be one of the spots where the mystery of God is born in overwhelming measure upon the souls of men, whatever their associations, whatever their creed. But we are dominated more by the idea that is behind us than by the spontaneous impressions of our senses. To the nomad of the desert, accustomed to the shifting of hot sands and ceaseless moving of the camps, with what coolness and refreshment must rise the thought of death. Mussulman piety has three motives: the glory of man, the charm of woman, and the holiness of the grave. In very early times, we see the august pastor, Abraham, seeking out a cave in which to place the body of his wife. Death, the fixed, the still, the cold, must be shrined within the steady and imperishable. The long home, a great rock in the weary land, endless rest, eternal cold and silence, all these are to be found in the grave. Is it not easy to understand that while the peasant, from the banks of the Ganges and the banks of the Tiber, turns naturally to burning of the dead, the wilderness dwellers bury him deep in Mother Earth, or build him about with unyielding granite, and thenceforth make this dwelling house of the beloved as the center of their own wanderings. Hence, what the sacred place of pilgrimage is to the Hindu, that the Taj Mahal, or the tomb of Aurangzeb, or the ever-memorable grave at Mecca, is to the pious Mussulman. Almost every Mohammedan village in India, too, has its sleeping place of some pir or saint. And I have seen a poverty-stricken God's acre where the sole treasure of the people was a gnarled and scarly living stump that marked the last home of a long-remembered holy man. For it is the ideal of the desert, rest from their wanderings and shadow from their scorching sun. It is this ideal, and not the natural dictation of their own birthplace, that has become the guiding power behind the life and choice of these Mosmalized Indian folk. And yet all their old poetry of soil comes out in the spot they choose. The tomb in the village grove, the Taj at the riverbed, the iris-covered graves on the riversides and hillocks of Kashmir. What pictures do these make at dawn and sunset, or through the long Indian night, with its mysterious voices sighing and whispering about the dead? Surely by thus adding the pastoral tradition to her own, India grows rich, not poor, in the things that form the true wealth of men. A pilgrim's camp is like some scene taken out of the Middle Ages. Or rather, it would be like it, but it is so largely depleted of militant elements. The Nagas, or armed friars, are no menace to anything in the modern system, which indeed at this moment they do not understand. And the authority that actually protects and keeps order amongst the pilgrims is to be sought rather in the unarmed district officer or Tehsildar than in anything that could be recognized as forceful by the naked eye. In the South, which is the home of orthodoxy, pilgrimage has gone out of fashion since the advent of railways. Fewer people, certainly fewer widows, visit Benares, since it became easier to do so. And those who have seen a genuine crowd of shrine-farers in some place remote from steam cannot wonder at the shock which the pious imagination suffers at the sight of a locomotive. Amongst other things that the religious traveler has a right to expect is the opportunity of a flight from the new India to the old as an actual environment. From any point where many ways meet, and various streams of pilgrims converge upon each other, the roads to the sacred place will be divided into regular stages of a day's journey, and at each halting place a camp will be pitched for the night. Even these rest camps will be situated as far as possible at spots peculiar for their beauty or interest. Is there a cluster of springs? The place is said to be holy, and we must halt there for worship. Originally, this referred only to beauty and convenience, but in process of time one cannot doubt that a certain atmosphere of insight and devotion has really thrown its halo about the dust and water of a locality. And in the place where so much simple faith has spent its rapture, the highest love and prayer have become easier to all comers. But the temples are all visited, the bathing is performed, evening worship is over, and silence and sleep fall upon the pilgrim's camp. The moon grows to the full, for we must arrive at the goal on the 15th day. And again, it is the simple beauty of the world which determines the law, that under the young moon shall be the going forth, and with her wane the return home. The moon is near the fullness, and weariness sleeps sound. At what hour is the first tent struck? When does the first sleeper rouse himself and take again to the road? Who can tell? Certainly not one who has never been able to rise so long before dawn that others were not up and afoot before her, and little heaps of white ashes from the cooking fires, the only sign of their 12 hours' tenancy of tree shadow or streamside. On go the pilgrims, singly or in groups. Old women, bent double with age, toil, hobbling along by the help of the pointed alpenstock. Monks of all descriptions are to be seen. Some of them are covered with ashes, have long reddish-looking hair, wear only the yellow loin-cloth, and carry curious tongs and begging bowls. These may be the yogis of the order that believes in the mortification of the flesh, or nagas, the militant monks, who were once ready to defend the faith at any moment, and to this day are powerfully organized to meet the shock of a world that has long ago, alas, passed away like a dream. The sannyasin, often a man of modern education, decently clad in the sacred salmon yellow, accepting no alms save food, refusing to touch of any metal, is there, doing the distance cheerfully on foot. Next comes the ascetic, with withered arm held aloft and useless this many a long year. Again a proud mahant, abbot of some rich foundation, master of elephants and treasure uncounted, is borne past. Or as one climbs, having abandoned the open dandy that costs such intolerable labor to the bearers on the mountain march, one may be joined in kindly chat by some one or two of the naked swamis, men who wear neither ash nor clothing beyond the necessary scanty rag, who wander among sunny deserts and snowy mountains alike, indifferent to heat and cold, and of whom, when one talks with them, one remembers nothing, save that here are friends of the culture of scholars, and the breeding and rank of gentlemen. But the crowd is still more motley. In camp, the strips of yellow cloth that so often do duty as a shelter for the religious stand side by side with tents of all sizes and conditions. And here now are zazana ladies, carried in scarlet-covered palkis, other women again on horseback, men and women alike on foot, or in open dandies, householders, widows, sannyatsinis in beads and yellow cloth. There are even some, too weak for walking or climbing, who are borne in straw chairs, strapped to the back of a man carrying a stout staff. On and on presses the irregular host, mixed up with Mohammedan baggage carriers and servants, cooks, and food vendors of all sorts. Here the road is broken by a glacier. There it becomes a mere goat path, running across dangerous crags. Here is the lake into which an avalanche, brought down by the hymn of triumph, once precipitated thousands of returning pilgrims. Now we have reached the heights where the ground is carpeted by edelweiss instead of grass. Again we are wandering amidst wildernesses of flowers, while every few yards the dominant note in the composition is changed imperceptibly. First the yellow wallflower, then flaming-colored Iceland poppies, again the long-stalked, single-headed Michaelmas daisies of the Himalayas. When the journey began, almost the only blossoms were the orchids on the tree trunks in the region of maidenhair fern. Now we have passed the last of the pine woods. Even the white birches, like smitten silver veining, blown sharp and twisted against the mountain sides, are gone. And tonight, when the tents are pitched over purple and white anemones, there will be no fuel save the juniper scrub that clings to the face of the rock in sheltered niches. On the edge of the last glacier, growing beside the gentian, we find an evergreen forget-me-not, unknown to us hitherto, and making the third or fourth new species, from a large crimson and purple myosotis onwards, which our pilgrimage has bestowed. Our neighbors in the tents about us are not amusing themselves by botanizing, probably, but they are communing with nature none the less, truly, than ourselves. On the last day, drawing nearer to the shrine, we shall see them risk their lives to gather the great nodding columbines and the little alpine roses growing on the rocks. Their talk is all of Siva. As they are borne along, they are striving, doubtless, to fix their minds on the repetition of his name, or the contemplation of his form. But the awesome grandeur and beauty of the heights about them will always be remembered by them as the great god's fit dwelling place. They are in a church. Rocks and glaciers form the sanctuary. Snowy passes are the pillared aisles. Behind them stand the pine forests, for processions of singers carrying banners, and overhead are the heavens themselves, for cathedral roof. It is the peculiarity of Eastern people to throw upon the whole of nature that feeling which we associate only with the place of worship. But is their love less real, or greater, for this fact? The day of the full moon comes, the last and most dangerous points are surmounted, and the shrine is reached. Happy the man or woman who, on this journey to God, is snatched out of life. One false step, and the soul that was struggling to see may be carried up at once in a swift, sure flight. Or death may come in other ways. It is so beautiful, I must be one with it, sighed a man who stood on a precipice looking down at the valleys. And before anyone could stop him, he was gone. Such things are not premeditated. There is a genuine ecstasy of the soul in which it hears the voice of the eternities calling to it, and the prisoning body becomes suddenly intolerable. Is it a stain upon Hinduism that it has never called this suicide while of unsound mind? But the shrine itself, where is it? What is it? Perhaps a temple placed above some gorge on a beetling rock with sister snows in sight? Perhaps the source of a sacred river? Perhaps a cave in which continual dripping of water makes a stalagmite of ice, a huge crystalline lingam that never melts? One can picture how such a place would first be discovered. Some party of shepherds, losing themselves and their flocks amongst the ravines on a summer day, and entering the cavern by accident, to find there the presence of the Lord himself. Men and beasts, awed and worshipping, how dear is such a picture to the Christian heart. Worship, worship, the very air is rent with prayer and hymns, for the unreal to the real, from the many to the one, Lord of animals, refuge of weariness, Siva, Siva, the free, the free. Hours pass, and ere dawn next day the descent to the valleys is begun. Wonderful is the snowy stillness of the lofty pass when, with our faces set homewards, the moon fades behind us, and the sun rises before. The pilgrims march with less regularity now. All are anxious to return, and some push on, while others break off from the line of route. We reach our own village and say farewell to the acquaintances of the pilgrimage, adding what comfort we may to the provision for their further journeying. The nights grow dark now, and the great experience becomes a memory, marked always, however, in the Hindu's life, by some special abstinence, practiced henceforth as the pilgrim's thank-offering. It is easy to believe that the scenes in which we have mingled are nowadays denuded of half their rightful elements, that once upon a time as many of the travelers would have been Tartar or Chinese as Indian, that the shrine represents what may have been the summer meeting of great trading caravans, that Nagarjuna and Bodhidharma, going out to the further east with their treasures of Indian thought, were in the first place pilgrims on some such pilgrimage as this. Even now, many of the functions of a university are served by the great gathering. Hundreds or even thousands of religious men meet, in a manner to eliminate personal ties of friendship and affection, and emphasize and refresh the ideal and intellectual aspects of their lives. At the vast assemblies of sadhus, which occur once every 12 years at Hurdwar, at Naisik, and at Allahabad, there are fixed halls of learned disputation, where, for hundreds of years, has been discussed, determined, and expanded, something in the fashion of the Welsh Eisteddfod. Here come the wandering monks of every part of India. Here the householder finds himself in vigorous and renewed relation to his faith. Here fresh voices of learning and devotion are able to win for themselves ecclesiastical authority. Such opportunities must have been the means by which Sankaracharya asserted his undisputed mastery of the world of Hindu scholarship. Did it, we wonder, occur to Alexander that learned Greeks might be sent to such wandering colleges in order to hear and to tell new things? Sanskrit is the lingua franca of this ancient learning. To this day, the visitor to a Calcutta toll may hear the boys dispute with each other on old time-worn themes in classic tongues, and may picture himself back in the colleges of Thebes or Athens in the long ago. But here in the great Milas are the crowning achievements towards which are directed the harder ambitions of those Brahmin boys. And we need not wonder at their enthusiasm for such distinction. The great open competition, with its thousands of years of prestige and learning, is like all the learned societies of a European metropolis thrown into one. The canvas city of a few weeks at Nasik or Allahabad serves all the purposes of Burlington House to London. But the system of culture to which Nasik belongs is no longer growing, it will be said. This is indeed its defect. The statement is not entirely true, for even now the test of a supremely national personality would still be, for the Hindu world, his power to add to their philosophy. But it is true to the extent that there is nothing left for collective thought to discover. The common mind of India has now to sweep great circles of intellectual exploration in worlds that as yet are virgin as the polar ice, or India will die. Of this there can be no doubt. Far away from the noisy throng of learned saints, or taking a humble place in white cotton garb as visitors amongst them, are the men whose lives are passed in the libraries of kings. For the system of patronage is part and parcel of Indian scholarship, and as the Japanese daimyo or the Italian prince maintained his artists and artificers, so, under the old regime, did every Indian palace possess its staff of palace pundits, men whose lives were made free of anxiety in order that they might heap up knowledge and pore over ancient texts. The supreme privilege of the great is to foster piety and learning. But, on the other hand, Manu does not fail to point out that there is no crime for the Brahmin like the acceptance of gifts from one who is not the lawful king. And it is not royal persons alone who are charged with the duty of supporting scholars. Never a wedding or a requiem can take place amongst the higher ranks of society without the distribution of money to tolls and pundits. For this is one of the postulates of ethical and therefore of Eastern economics, that all great accumulation is for subsequent distribution. It is a strange world that has been revealed to us in this camp of pilgrimage, and it is not easy to reach its full significance. Scarcely in any two tents do they understand each other's language, and we shall do better to ask for bread in Sanskrit than in English. Malabaris and Bengalis, Sikhs and Madrasis, Marathas and even Mussulmans, dwell side by side for the nonce. Could incongruity and disunion be more strongly illustrated? Yet it was unity and not disunity that impressed us as we looked. From one end of the camp to the other, the same simple way of life, the same sacramental reverence for food and bathing, the same gentleness and courtesy, the same types of face and character, and above all, one great common scheme of thought and purpose. The talk may be in different languages, but no matter at what tent door we might become eavesdroppers, we should find its tone and subject much the same. Always the lives of the saints, always the glory of the soul, always fidelity to Guru and Dharma. By two formulae and two alone, renunciation and freedom from personality, is all life here interpreted. Other countries have produced art, chivalry, heroic poems, inventive systems. In none of these has India been altogether wanting, yet none is her distinguishing characteristic. What, then, has she given to the world that is beyond all competition? Today her gifts are decried by all men, for today the mighty mother is become widowed and abased. She who has opened port to all fugitives is unable now to give bread to her own children. She with whom Farsi, Jew, and Christian have been thankful to take refuge, is despised and ostracized by all three alike. She who has prized knowledge above all her treasures finds her learning now without value in the markets of the world. It is urged that the test of utility is the true standard for things transcendental, and that an emancipation into modern commerce and mechanics is a worthier goal for her son's striving than the old-time aim of knowledge for its own sake, an ideal for itself. And the modern world may be right. But even so, has India in the past given nothing, without which our whole present would be the poorer? Who that has caught even a whisper of what her name means can say so? Custom kept always as an open door, through which the saints may dance into our company, thought sustained at a level where religion and science are one, a maze of sublime apostrophes and world-piercing prayers, above all, the power to dream rare dreams of the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among men, that they may behold His glory. Are these things nothing? If, after all, the higher transformation of man be the ultimate end of human effort, which has more deeply vindicated its right to exist, the modern nexus of commerce and finance, or that old world on which we have gazed in the pilgrim's camp? End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Web of Indian Life by Sister Nivedita. Margaret E. Noble. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. On the Loom of Time. The essential differences between countries of the Asiatic and European types are as yet but little understood, and a main difficulty in the growth of an understanding is the absence of elements in the English language embodying any wide power of social survey. The disciples of Auguste Comte have done much to popularize certain important words and conceptions, but the hearts of angels and the tongues of poets would be too little to meet all the necessities of the task. The word theocracy, for instance, which is essential to an understanding of Asia, either territorial or historic, has been an ambiguous sound in English. To the learned positivist, it means the social system built up on theism. To the vulgar, it indicates some fabulous scheme of divine monarchy, such as is popularly attributed to Israel before the days of Saul, or to England in the dreams of Oliver Cromwell. To persons thinking in the latter fashion, the two statements that India is a theocracy and that it is at present occupied by the British Raj seem incompatible. It is clear that only detailed and penetrative knowledge of concrete examples can build up in our minds such a conception of the essentials of a theocratic system as shall give us the power of handling the term as confidently and intelligently as we now feel capable of using more purely political expressions. And of such examples it will be found best to take the nearest first. In the history of the world, the city of Rome occupies a unique position as the occidental cradle and battlefield of two opposing forces, the imperial and the theocratic, or, as one may prefer to call them, the European and the Asiatic ideas. For it was Rome that first imposed upon the West that notion of organized force which is almost all that is at present meant by the state empire. And through all the feuds and disorders of the Middle Ages, it was the Roman impulse that was working itself out by the energy of barbarian peoples to its perfect triumph in the 19th century. Caesar conceived, Napoleon completed the imperial scheme. Alexander, as an individual, may have seen what they saw, but Greece was far too near to Asia, and his military designs could but evaporate before their time into mere learned observations and the exchange of interesting thought. It was left to Rome to elaborate into fixity of precision that destiny which could not perhaps have been avoided by the peoples of a coastline kept militant by the daily conquest of nature, tempted to aggression by the very habits of their life. For empire in the European sense is a very different thing from the marauding hosts of the East going out to warfare, headed by a commander of brilliant prowess. Rome instituted, and modern Europe has inherited, the idea of one people exploiting another, under rights strictly defined by law, with an appearance of order which would deceive the very elect. The Caesars failed by the strength of the unassimilable elements which their empire had to meet. Napoleon failed because those whom he temporarily subdued were as strong to react in imitation as to be assimilated. Today the Roman Empire is represented by some 8 or 10 emulous peoples and princes, all armed to the teeth, all bent on appropriating the world. But it is the Roman Empire still. And yet Rome herself is the one character whose part in the drama is completely transformed. For no one yet thinks of her as a metropolis of the juvenile kingdom of Italy. To the imagination of humanity, she is still the city of the Church. St. Peter's and the Vatican still form her central point. The Pope still rules. This contrast between her first and second selves is much more startling than the transition by which the brigand chief becomes the sainted ancestor. Before it happened, it would have seemed far more absurd than it would be today to propose to make the name of Oxford or Benares a synonym for the vulgar competition of trade. For Rome, the supreme, the invincible, has actually been conquered by the ideas of the East. The poor and the lowly have taken her by storm. Henceforth is she to be in Europe not the voice of domination, but of renunciation, not the teacher of aggression, but of self-sacrifice. Royal in her rank and her prerogatives, certainly, but far more deeply and truly the friend of the people than of kings. Henceforth, those who are in a special sense her children will live sequestered from the world, pursuing after poverty instead of riches, after self-mortification instead of self-indulgence, men and women apart, as in the Eastern household. Every simple act that she enjoins will possess a sanctity out of all proportion to its intrinsic value. Her customs will become rituals. Her journeys will be pilgrimages. The simplest ordinances of life, administered by her, will now be sacraments. The expression of her forgiveness will be absolution, of her affection a benediction. Her very rulers will claim no personal right to their high places, but will declare themselves simple executors of the divine will. Servant of the servants of God will be, to the thinking of the world, their proudest title. In the eyes of the Church henceforth, all men are to be equal, at least until one has made himself a saint, and another Judas. The differences of rank established by the world are to be as nothing before her, and even ecclesiastical gradations are to be merely as conditions on which grace can work. Many of the saints will be humble and unlearned. Many a bishop will reach the lowest hell. Rank, at least theoretical, is nothing to Rome. Her children are all to be the sharers of a common supernatural life, of which a religious banquet is the token. The great responsibility is to rest upon them, of living worthily by the name by which they are called. Their life, as related to each other and to her, can be expressed only in terms of the exploration and manifestation of certain ideals, laid down broadly in authoritative writings known as scriptures, and with less clearness and power in secondary writings and teachings called traditions. In other words, the imperial city has transformed herself into a pure theocracy. If we blot out the idea of birth by a sacramental rite, and substitute that of a chosen place and race, keeping everything else approximately the same, the Church has retransmuted into any one out of half a dozen Eastern countries, ancient Egypt, Judea, Arabia, modern India, under the government of the religious idea. Here, too, the priesthood dominates all classes equally, and the priestly interpretation of life prevails. The very gifts one brings home from a journey are explained as temple offerings. Here, too, the political system is extraneous, custom is sacred, so that a grammar of habit takes the place of legislation. Men and women live apart. Merit is the sole condition of social prestige, and so on. It is due to the purely natural character of the great complexus that we have in India the, to us so extraordinary, spectacle of a society handed over to the power of a priesthood, without in any way losing its sense of the universal sacredness of learning and freedom of thought. In the case of Rome, where an artificial system has created on the basis of a foreign experience, the crude temper of an old imperialism betrayed itself primarily against mind and thought, which it conceived as the legitimate sphere of its authority. In Catholic Europe, a man might scarcely venture to believe that the earth moves, must apologize for enjoying the cosmic speculations of Laplace, could hardly study Plato without grave suspicion. In India, atheism itself might be preached on the very steps of the temple. All that the people would demand of the preacher would be sincerity. In Christendom, knowledge has been so much feared that men have again and again suffered torture and death for no other crime. In India, knowledge has always been held to be beatitude. Abundance of words in every Indian language testify to the honor paid to scholars. Persian and English books are held as sacred as Sanskrit, and we should seek in vain, throughout history and language, for any trace of limitation imposed, or suggested to be imposed, upon the mind of man. Even the vexed question of the right of literature to reveal more than is permitted in conversation was foreseen long ago and settled in a flash of wit by the legislator who, writing of defilement by the touch of the mouth, makes 3 exceptions in favor of the beaks of birds, the lips of women, and the words of poets. In fact, opinion is so free that religious propaganda is actually discouraged by Hinduism, lest zeal, outrunning discretion, proves mischievous to society. A man has a right to hold his own belief, but never to force it upon another, is the dictum that has made of India a perfect university of religious culture, including every phase and stage of thought and practice, from that of the kindergarten, where all is concrete, to that of the higher research student, who has direct visualization of the solutions of problems which most of us cannot even understand. But freedom of thought in the East has not been the prerogative of religion alone. The deeper we go into the history of Hindu philosophy, the more perplexed we are that, with its obviously scientific character, it should never have created a scientific movement of the prestige and éclat of that of the West. Patanjali, who wrote his great psychology in the 2nd century BC, was obviously a physiologist, studying the living body in relation to that nervous system which in its entirety he would call the mind. The action and interaction of the living neuropsychoses is a question which modern science, content with a more static view of human structure, has hardly yet ventured to tackle, and students of Patanjali cannot be controverted if they hold that when it is reached, it will only be to corroborate the ancient investigations step by step. But a still more interesting feature of Patanjali's work lies in the fact that it is obviously the final record of a long research carried out not by a single individual, but by a whole school, experimenting continuously through many generations. Each man's labor was conditioned by the fact that he had no laboratory and no instruments outside his own body, and there can be no doubt that life was often sacrificed to the thirst for knowledge. The whole, therefore, is like the resume of 2 or 3 centuries of the conclusions of some English Royal Society or some French Academy of Sciences, dating from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And we must remember that if the terminology of this old science has a certain quaintness in our ears, this is probably no greater than that which our own talk of forces and molecules, of chemical affinities and smygmographic records would have if it were suddenly recovered after a lapse of 2,000 years by a new civilization stationed, say, in Mexico. What is true of the psychology is equally true of Indian mathematics, astronomy, surgery, chemistry. The Oriental predilection for meditative insight is an advantage in the field of mathematics, where deduction is a necessity, but at the same time its fundamental solidity and originality are shown by the fact that highly abstruse problems are stated by Hindu thinkers in concrete and even in poetic terms. And it will be remembered that less than 100 years ago, De Morgan celebrated the solution at sight of certain hitherto uncompleted problems of the maxima and minima by a young Hindu called Ramchandra. The law of gravitation itself was enunciated and discussed by Bhaskaracharya in the 12th century, and the antiquity of the Sanskrit word shunyo for not, together with the immemorial distribution of the system all over the country, conclusively proves that our decimal notation is Indian and not Arabic in origin. How is it then, we repeat, that a more imposing scientific activity has not been the result of a faculty so undeniable? Many considerations may be adduced in explanation. There is the vast international organization of scientific effort in Europe today, operating to make an incomparable sum of results. Ancient India knew what was meant by scientific cooperation, but by organization scarcely. And no one nation, working alone, could have produced the whole of what we know as modern science, or even one division of it. Ancient Greece gives us the first word on electricity. What a leap from this is Volta and Galvani! Where again had these been without the German Hertz, the French Ampere, the Hindu Bose? And then Italy for a second time takes up the thread of inquiry and produces the apparatus for wireless telegraphy. Again, we must remember that in Europe today we have renounced almost everything for science. Art and letters are almost at a standstill. In these departments, at least in every country outside France and Russia, we are living almost entirely on the treasures of the past. In religion, we see the same superficial eclecticism, the same absence of genuine contemporary impulse. But India never was in this position. Side by side with the learned man, speculating or experimenting on the secrets of nature, the builders were raising the village temple, the shuttle flew to and fro in the loom, the clinks of the tools was heard in the brass smithy, the palace pundits busied themselves with their collections of ancient texts. The saints poured forth the rapture of their souls. The peasant waked and slept in the good company of nature, rice field and palm tree, cattle and farmstead. Faith, art, and industry lived on undisturbed. After all, is it not possible that we deceive ourselves? The true secret of our elimination of every other intellectual activity in favor of science, is it really the depth of our enthusiasm for knowledge, Or is it not rather our modern fever for its mechanical application? How far is the passion for pure truth unimpaired by commercial interests? How far is our substitution of specialisms for synthesis conditioned by finance merely? When our utilitarian ingenuity draws nearer exhaustion, when the present spasm of inventive ability has worked itself out, then, and not till then, will come the time for estimating the actual profundity or disinterestedness of our scientific ardor. Will our love of knowledge continue to drive us on to a still deeper theoretic insight? Or will our investigations languish in our hands, lingering on as a mere fashion in learning, even as Aristotle lingered on through the Middle Ages? Till such questions are nearer finding their answer, we are in no position to assume that the present period is, or is not, ultimately scientific. Meanwhile, in India, this danger of a mercenary science was always foreseen and viewed with perhaps an exaggerated horror, so that from the beginning the disciple has been required to seek knowledge for its own sake, renouncing all ulterior motive. The value derived at the present stage of development from incorporating a progressive science in a progressive civilization was thus lost. Although we must remember that in a very real sense, such a transition, shorn of its lower elements, has occurred in the East from prehistoric times, whenever new plants and animals were to be domesticated, or new tools invented. On the other hand, it is still open to India, facing the actual conditions of the modern world, to prove that the innate capacity of her people for scientific work and inquiry has been in no way lessened by this long abstention from its vulgar profits. In spite, nevertheless, of the relative non-development of the natural science in India, it is the perfect compatibility of the Hindu religious hypothesis with the highest scientific activity that is to make that country within the present century the main source of the new synthesis of religion for which we in the West are certainly waiting. Several nations cannot suddenly come into contact by the use of a common language without a violent shock being given to their prejudices in favor of local mythology. Such an occurrence was inevitable in English-speaking countries under the present circumstances, and has been accelerated, as it happens, by the agnosticism born of scientific activity. Christianity, moreover, has been further discredited by the discovery that its adherents possess no ethics sufficiently controlling to influence their international relations, and finally by that worship of pleasure which an age of exploitation necessarily engenders. Thus neither the sentiment of childhood, the reasoning of theology, the austerity of conscience, nor the power of idealism has been strong enough to maintain the creed of the West against the assaults to which the age has seen it subjected. Everything seems to be going through a transition. Social morality, intellectual formulas, legal and economic relationships, all have broken loose from their old moorings and are seeking for readjustment. The first agony of the loss of belief is now over, but it has only given place to a dreary hopelessness, a mental and spiritual homelessness, which drives some in whom heart predominates into the Church of Rome, while others in whom the faculties are more evenly balanced try to forget their need in social service or in the intellectual and artistic enjoyments of an era of resumes. Protestantism has at last delivered herself of a genuine religious product of the highest order, in that love of naked truth which finds its voice and type in modern science. For all other forms of non-Catholicism are more or less compromises, mere halfway houses on the road to this. But even in this, the environment of spirituality and the communion of saints are apt to be left behind with the medieval church. Is there no way to combine these things? Can the devotional attitude receive no justification from the clear and unbiased mind? Does religion, which is made so much of faith, want less than absolute conviction as its basis? Is that sentiment which has produced all the greatest art, and almost all the greatest conduct, to be relegated to the mental lumber room as, after all, only a superstition? Surely, if so, there is an eternal inharmony and divergence between the creative and the inquiring faculties of man. But the very constitution of our minds forbids us to accept this paradox. It may be that we are no longer able to believe in the exclusive authenticity of any single religious system, but we are fast inclining to the opinion that even here there must be some observable sequence, that creeds and mythologies must be as genuine a product of the unity of things as the animals and the plants, that order and meaning there must be, in the one case as in the other. Instead, therefore, of a contemptuous disregard of all faiths as equally untrue, we are beginning to adopt to all alike an attitude of respect as equally significant. Only in India has this recognition of law in religious conceptions ever been held in its completeness as a part of religion itself. Only in India have inspired teachers been able to declare that the name of God, being also an illusion, differed only from worldly things in having the power of helping us to break our bondage to illusion, while they, on the other hand, increased it. Only in India has it been counted orthodoxy to believe that all is within the mind, that the forms of gods are but objectifications of our own sense of what is best to be obtained, that prayer is only the heightening of the will. And therefore it is from India that we shall gather that intellectualization of belief which is to reestablish, in the name of a new and greater synthesis, our confidence in our own past. In this new synthesis, every element of our own thought must find a place. The conception of humanity and the worship of truth, of course, because without these it would have no raison d'être. But even the emotionalism of the Negro must not go unplaced, uninterpreted, any more than that wondrous mood in which the explorer of knowledge finds himself launched into a vision of unity that he dare not name. Neither the Catholic organization of monasticism nor the Protestant, taken from the Mohammedan, inspiration of common prayer can be left out. There must be a religious consciousness strong enough to recognize the anguish of denial as its own most heroic experience, and large enough to be tender and helpful to the ignorance of a child. In that other synthesis which grew up under the Roman Empire, all the Mediterranean peoples and those originally related to them found a part. The doctrine of immortality came from the desert. Resurrection, mediatorship, and personal consciousness of sin from ancient Egypt. Many elements from Persia and Syria. Purity and asceticism from the Asokan Essenes, the basis of ethics to be transcended by Judea. The spirit of inquiry and the necessary feeling of an intellectual void from Greece, or at least from the Greek elements in Mediterranean society. The instinct of organization from Rome, and the all-absorbing renunciation and compassion for the world that alone can give sufficient nucleus for a new religion from one sweet central personality, in whom each of these various hungers found its own Bethlehem, its own house of bread. Similarly, in the new upgrowth of our own days, many preparatory influences now at work are to find fulfillment. All who have felt the love of the disinherited and oppressed, all who have followed truth for its own sake, all who have longed to lose themselves in a paradise of devotion and been refused by the armed reason standing at the gate, all who have felt out for a larger generalization, as they saw the faith of their babyhood falling away from them, all these have helped and are helping to build up the new consciousness, to make the faculty that is to recognize and assimilate the doctrine of the future. But the evangel itself will be mainly drawn from India. And then, having thus renewed the sources of the world's inspiration, we may be pardoned if we ask, what of India herself? The Egyptian delivered up her whole treasure, and where is he now? Buried under many a layer of foreign invasion, tilling the soil as patiently and hopelessly as one of his own oxen, scarcely remembered, even as a name, by those who make so-called plans for the country's good, and are wakened only to a stupid wonder, as at a sound of something familiar from books, when they hear that to kill a cat today in a bazaar in Cairo would almost cost a man his life. The Jews produced Jesus, and what have they become? Pariahs and fugitives amongst the nations of men. Who remembers them with any feeling of gratitude for that which they have given? A miserable formula, the Jews who crucified him, has taken the place amongst the devout of any memorial of the fact that they created the language, the thoughts, the habits of life, and the outlook of righteousness in which he assumed the garb of humanity. Is something of this sort to be the fate of India? To give a religion to the world may be a sufficient proof that one's past was not in vain, but evidently it is no sort of safeguard for the future. The process by which the peoples of a vast continent may become mere hewers of wood and drawers of water has already begun, is already well afoot. Their indigenous institutions are all in decay, their prosperity gone. Some portion or other of the immense agricultural area is perpetually under famine. Their arts and industries are dead or dying. They have lapsed into mere customers for other men's cheap wares. Even their thought would seem to be mainly imitative. The orthodox is apt to tread the round of his own past eternally. The unorthodox is as apt to harness himself to the foreign present with an equal blindness. In suicidal depression, the would-be patriotic reiterate the war cries of antagonistic sects, or moan of the advent of a new religion, as if, by introducing a fifth element of discord, the Indian peoples could reach unity. Nor does the education at present offered promise any solution of the problem. It is the minimum that is possible to the efficient clerk, and even that minimum is undergoing reduction rather than increase. In spite of the absence of any theory of history that might elucidate the course of events in the East during the next 2 centuries, one truth reveals itself with perfect plainness. A nation becomes whatever she believes herself to be. She is made great, not by her own relative superiority, but by her thoughts about herself. It becomes important, therefore, to ask, what conception of her own nature and power forms the inheritance of India? As Roman Catholicism is but one element inhering to the great whole called Christianity, and as a man may well claim to be a good Christian without being a Catholic, so the religious system of Hinduism is only a fragment inhering in a vast social, industrial, economic scheme called the Dharma, and a man may well and rightly be the servant of the Dharma without calling himself a Hindu. It is this Dharma, in its large and non-sectarian activity, that determines the well-being of every child of the Indian soil. The word itself is an ancient name for national righteousness or national good. It is true that the Brahmin who bows before one who is not the rightful king is held many times accursed by Manu. It is true that the Bhagavad Gita is the only one of the world gospels that turns on the duty of fighting for the true sovereign against usurpers. Yet it is also a fact that the person of the ruler is always a matter of singular indifference to the theocratic consciousness. It has been hitherto indeed a mere detail for military persons to fight out amongst themselves. The secret of so curious an attitude is reached when we discover that in the eyes of the Indian peasant, the sovereign himself is only the servant of the Dharma. If he will uphold it, he will stay. If not, he will have to go, they all say when questioned. Little do they dream, alas, that themselves and their children and their children's children may be swept into oblivion also by that same failure to uphold. Thus, whoever was the master that an Indian statesman served, whether Hindu, Mussulman, or British, sat upon the throne, it was the minister's duty, as the loyal and obedient child of an Asiatic race, to use all his influence in the best interests of his people and his country. It is this element in the national system that tends, with its great regard for agriculture, to rank the cow almost on a level with the human members of the Commonwealth, making the Hindu sovereign forbid beef-eating within its frontiers. It was this that made a certain prince, in despair, hand over his salt mines to the British government, rather than obey its mandate to tax this commodity to his people, and thus derive personal benefit from their misfortune. And it was this that made it incumbent upon many of the chiefs of the old days to provide, not only salt, but also water and fruit free to their subjects, a kind of noblesse oblige that has left the wayside orchard outside every village in Kashmir, till that favored land is almost like the happy island of Avalon, fair with orchard lawns and bowery hollows crowned with summer sea. It was this power of the Dharma to safeguard the welfare of its people through a law as binding upon the monarchs as upon its subjects, that brought about the immense network of custom which regulated the relief of beggars, the use of water, the provisioning of pilgrimages, habits of sanitation, distribution of grazing lands, the forest rights of the peasant, and 1,000 other matters of importance. The mere fact that the king's personal devotions were offered in a mosque could not interfere with his acceptance of the system in any important measure. It was the language of rule, dominating all rulers alike, by every detail of birth and upbringing, and by the very impossibility of imagining any deviation. Hence, it could never be more than a question of time till some new prince had assimilated the whole, and Mussulman cooperated actively with Hindu in the great task of enforcing and extending the essentials of the common weal. We may regret, but we cannot condone, the strange indolence by which the Indian people have permitted themselves to lose sight of these national and civic responsibilities of their ancient civilization, and become absorbed in its personal and domestic rights. Nor can we for one moment admit that this substitution of the trees for the forest deserves the name of orthodoxy, faithfulness to the Dharma. It is, however, an essential weakness of theocratic rule that while it can tolerate any neighbor, it has no idea of dominating and unifying diverse elements round itself. The great mass of its subjects, too, see life indirectly through the nimbus of the supernatural. Instead of subordinating the priesthood in national affairs to the recognized leaders of the nation, exalting it only in its rightful capacity of influence upon the social and individual conscience, a theocracy is apt to require that its leaders move, encumbered by the counsels of the priests. It was the Prophet's clear perception of these facts that gave its peculiar characteristics to Islam. He established a strong confraternity, and made subscription to a belief and concise formula the sole condition of membership. But Arab blood was comparatively unmixed, and the greater part of Muhammad's work was done for him in the close bond of consanguinity that united his central group. At one bound, and without any means save that power of personality which is the first demand of the theocratic method, he performed the double task of creating an all-absorbing consciousness of nationality and carrying his people through the required emancipation of thought. To this day, the great Semitized belt that divides Eastern Aryans and Mongolians from Europe reminds us, whenever we look at the map, of the reality of his achievement. And the history of the origins of European learning remains to attest the enthusiasm of freedom which he conferred on the Saracenic intellect. Geographical conditions impose upon India the same necessity of unification at all costs, and yet combine with other facts to make her the meeting ground of all races. Especially is this the case in modern times, when the ocean has become a roadway instead of a boundary. She is almost a museum of races, creeds, and social formulations, some hoary with age, some crude with excessive youth. Thus her problem is vastly more difficult than that of Arabia before the 7th century. Yet she contains in herself every element of self-discovery. If the fact had been open to doubt before, the British rule, with its railways, its cheap postage, and its common language of affairs, would have sufficiently demonstrated the territorial unity of the country. We can see today that India's is an organic, and no mere mechanical unity. The North, it has been said, produces prophets, the South priests. And it is true that her intellectual and discriminating faculty, her power of recognition and formulation, lies in the South, that Maratha, Mussulman, and Sikh form her executive, while to Bengal, the country that has fought no battle for its own boundaries, falls the office of the heart, which will yet suffuse all the rest with the realization of the vast inclusiveness of the meaning of the great word India. Historically, the Indian unity is obvious, and if socially it appears doubtful, the country itself could set aside the doubt in any instance by grasping that intuition of nationality which alone is needed to give the spiritual impulse towards consolidation. But the bare fact of an actual social, historical, and geographical unity, waiting for precipitation as a national consciousness, is not the only possession of India at the present crisis. She has a great past to return upon, and a clearly defined economy for model. Her traditions are unstained. There is no element of national life, art, poetry, literature, philosophy, science, in which she has not at some time been exceptionally strong. She has organized at least 2 empires of commanding character. In architecture, 3 of the most imposing styles in the world have been hers: the Dravidian in the south, the Buddhist across Middle India from Orissa to Bombay, and the Indo-Saracenic in the north. There can be little doubt that her next period will confront India with the necessity of introducing some community of ritual as between priest and people, and this of itself must create fresh architectural needs, a new architecture of the communal consciousness, which would be sufficient to make the required appeal to the national imagination, and at the same time give the needed scope to the passion of democracy. For in looking to the growth of a sentiment of nationality as the solution of Indian problems, we are of course turning away from kings and priests, and appealing to woman and the people. A similar appeal, in the only form possible to the unmixed theocracy of that day, was made by Buddhism. And the whole history of India, from the Christian era onwards, is the story of the education of the popular consciousness by the unifying and ameliorating influence of Hinduism, as it was then thrown open. Today, if we adopt moral and intellectual tests as the criteria of civilization, we can hardly refuse to admit that in such issues the East has been more successful than the West. In strength of family ties, in sweetness and decorum of family life, in widespread understanding of the place of the personal development in the scheme of religion as a whole, in power of enjoyment of leisure without gross physical accompaniments, in dignity, frugality, continuous industry without aggressive activity, in artistic appreciation of work done and doing, and above all, in the ability to concentrate the whole faculty at will. Even the poorest classes in India, whatever their religion, will compare favorably with many who are far above them in the West. Such are some of the results of the Buddhist period. The Mughal Empire fell into decay and failed simply because it did not understand how to base itself on a great popular conception of Indian unity. It could neither assimilate the whole of the religious impulse of India, nor yet detach itself completely from it. Hence, as a government, it succeeded neither in rooting itself permanently, nor in creating that circuit of national energy which alone could have given it endurance. Nevertheless, it contributed invaluable elements to the national life of the future, and it is difficult to see how that life could hope to organize itself without its memorable preliminary experiment. The foreign character of the English period produced, at its first effect, a wide sense of bewilderment and unrest, which gave birth to 100 projected panaceas. There were social reformers who thought that by a program more purely destructive than they realized, their motherland would be best served. And while we may deprecate the form taken by their zeal, we can but admit that no other testimony could have been given to the living energy of the race which would have been so convincing. If Indian civilization had really been stationary, as it is sapiently supposed in the West, the embers could hardly have leapt into such flame at the bare touch of new ideas. If, on the other hand, the country had accepted the superficial theory and run agate in the endeavor to reform itself, we could not thereafter have conceived of India as possessing sufficient depth and stability to make hope possible. Meanwhile, the reformers have not failed to bring forth fruit. They have produced groups of persons who represent what is valuable in Western thought and habits, without necessarily being denationalized, and they have demonstrated once for all the fact that India contains sufficient forces of restitution within herself to be completely independent of foreign advice and criticism. Next came political agitators, who seemed to think that by entire deference to an alien idea their country would be saved. There can be no doubt that here also a valuable contribution has been made. The foreign idea can never save India. Indeed, the use of the word politics in the present state of the country may strike some of us as a painful insincerity. But at the same time, the mastery and assimilation of the foreigner's method is an absolute necessity. The education of the people, also, to a knowledge of their common interests, and the throwing of a net of friendship and mutual intercourse all over the country are great services. Outside social and political movements again, there are 100 emancipations and revivals of religious centers, all of which are noteworthy symptoms of inherent vitality. And still a fourth school declares that the one question of India lies in the economic crisis, and that once surmounted, all will be well. At this moment, however, a new suspicion is making itself heard, a suspicion that behind all these interpretations, the social reform, the political agitation, religious movements, and economic grievances, there stands a greater reality, dominating and coordinating the whole, the Indian national ideal, of which each is part. It begins to be thought that there is a religious idea that may be called Indian, but it is of no single sect, that there is a social idea which is the property of no caste or group, that there is a historical evolution in which all are united, that it is the thing within all these which alone is to be called Indian. If this conception should prevail, it will be seen that social, political, economic, and religious workers have all alike helped to reveal it. But it can never be allowed that the whole problem is economic, grave as the last mentioned feature of the situation undoubtedly is. It is not merely the status, but the very nature and character of the collective personality of the whole nation, occupying one of the largest areas in the world, that has to be recaptured. In the days when ancient Egypt made an eternal impression on human civilization, the personal belongings of her great nobles were no more than those of an Indian cowherd today. It was the sentiment of fraternity, the instinct of synthesis, the mind of cooperation that were the secret of her power. The distinctive spirituality of the modern world depends upon its ability to think of things as a whole, to treat immense masses of facts as units, to bring together many kinds of activity, and put them in true relation to one another. This is the reality of which map, census, and newspaper, even catalogue, museum, and encyclopedia, are but outer symbols. In proportion as she grasps this inner content, will India rise to the height of her own possibilities. The sacraments of a growing nationality would lie in new developments of her old art, a new application of her old power of learnedness, new and dynamic religious interpretations, a new idealism, in short, true child of the nation's own past, with which the young should throb and the old be reverent. The test of its success would be the combining of renewed local and individual vigor with the power of self-centralization and self-expression hitherto unknown. But before such a result could come about, we must suppose the children of every province and every sect on fire with the love of the motherland. Sikh, Maratha, and Mussulman, we must imagine possessed each by the thought of India, not of his own group. Thus, each name distinguished in the history of any part would be appropriated by the country as a whole. The Hindu would prostrate himself on the steps of the mosque, the Mohammedan offer salutation before the temple, the Aryan write the history of Islam with an enthusiasm impossible to those within its walls, the Semite stand forth as the exponent of India's heroic past, with the authority of one who sees for the first time with the eyes of manhood. For we cannot think that a mere toleration of one another's peculiarities can ever be enough to build up national sentiment in India. As the love of David and Jonathan, a love the stronger for distance of birth, such is that last and greatest passion which awakes in him who hears the sorrowful crying of the young and defenseless children of his own mother. Each difference between himself and them is a source of joy. Each need unknown to himself feeds his passion for self-sacrifice. Their very sins meet with no condemnation from him, their sworn champion and servant. But has India today the hidden strength for such developments? What of the theocratic consciousness? What of the warring religious convictions? Whether or not she has adequate strength for her own renewal, only the sons of India are competent to judge. But it is certain that, in the nationalizing of the great nation, the two theocracies would reach, on the human side, their common flowering point. Do not all kingdoms of God hold forth the hope of a day when the lame shall walk, and the blind see, the leper be cleansed, and the poor have the gospel preached unto them? The theocratic consciousness is never jealous of the social good, but profoundly susceptible of it. It seeks it indeed as its true goal. What of the theocratic consciousness, what of religion, should a day ever come to pass in which men discovered that divine revelations were meant to unite humanity, not to sunder it? Surely the question is hardly serious. The old orthodoxy of the Arab would still be the austerity of the Mohammedan. The ancient piety of the Hindu would still and forever be the church of the devoted life. Yet both would have found new purpose and common scope in the remaking of the motherland. Nevertheless, the question remains. The road is clear, but has India strength to follow it? Jackals prowl about the buried cities and deserted temples of the Asokan era. Only a memory dwells within the remarkable palaces of the Mughal. Is that mighty mother not now exhausted? Having given to the world, is it not enough? Is she again to rouse and bestir herself for the good of her own household? Who can tell? Yet in all the impotence and desolation of the present, amidst the ruin of his country and the decay of his pride, an indomitable hope wakes still in the heart of the Indian peasant. That which is shall pass, and that which has been shall again be, he mutters, to the end of time. And we seem to catch in his words the sound of a greater prophecy, of which his is but an echo. Whenever the Dharma decays, and Adharma prevails, then I manifest myself, for the protection of the good, for the destruction of the evil, for the firm establishment of the national righteousness. I am born again and again. End of chapter 16. End of The Web of Indian Life by Sister Nivedita, Margaret E. Noble.